Tell me, Muse, of the man of many ways. Nearly 3,000 years ago, a poet stood before an audience and began with a single request. These words would survive the collapse of kingdoms, the rise and fall of empires, the burning of libraries, and the passing of almost 3 millennia. They would inspire philosophers, kings, artists, explorers, and eventually Hollywood. So on this week's episode, one of the world's most celebrated filmmakers, Christopher Nolan, has attempted what many would call impossible, bringing the Odyssey to the big screen. But adapting Homer isn't like adapting any ordinary novel. This isn't just another blockbuster. It's one of the oldest surviving stories ever told, a cornerstone of Western literature, born from a world where gods walked among men, honor meant everything, and a journey home became one of humanity's greatest epics. The question is, has Hollywood and Nolan faithfully brought Homer's vision to life, or has it simply created another version for the modern age? Tonight we're not just reviewing a movie, we're beginning a deep historical investigation into the world of Homer, the Odyssey, the Bronze Age, and the modern day. The episode starts now. Good evening, you're listening to The Truth Tank and I'm your host, The Tank. If this is your first time listening to The Truth Tank, a big welcome. If you are a repeat listener, welcome back. On tonight's episode, I'll be reviewing one of the most hotly anticipated films of 2026, and that is Christopher Nolan's interpretation of Homer's The Odyssey. There's been a fair bit of hype around this film for a couple of years now. There's been controversies, criticisms. Is it a faithful adaptation? An interpretation of Homer, or is it just another modern interpretation of a classic designed for a modern audience? This episode is also the first installment in what will be a long-running deep dive investigation into the world of Homer, the late Bronze Age, and the Odyssey. I'm not sure how many parts it's going to be at the moment. It's definitely going to be more than 3. It will probably be between 4 to 6 separate parts. I aim to have one out every 2 weeks. There's a lot of research that's going to go into this episode, so it might take me a little longer to produce these episodes. There'll be some other film reviews in between that, and maybe a couple of current events if anything happens. I'm really hoping nothing happens in the world. I'm sick of covering current events. I've also got a very special guest coming up. It's my first international guest I've had on the podcast, so definitely stay tuned for that. That's coming up in August. I was planning a 3-part series on the Odyssey, when I obviously knew I was going to do a film review on Nolan's The Odyssey. But I thought I wanted to go a bit deeper than that. This is one of my favourite subjects, history. I've been a big fan of Homer for a very long time. The Iliad and the Odyssey are 2 of my favourite books. I don't read a lot of fiction, but I've read both of these multiple times. I'm very familiar with the stories. I've been into them since I was a kid. So I wanted to do a deep dive into the world of Homer. The original plan was to do a film review, then a comparison with Homer's book, and the real-life possibility of Odysseus' voyage. But then I got thinking, I thought, no, I want to go even deeper than that. I want to do a big examination into the world of Homer, into the poetry, the mythology, the philosophy, as well as look at the late Bronze Age. But for now, let's have a look at Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. So without further ado, this is episode 109 of The Truth Tank. The Odyssey Files, Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey Review, Modern Myth, Modern Interpretation, or Misplaced Meaning. Just before I get too far into the review, This episode will contain spoilers and major ones, so if you haven't seen the film and are planning to, or you're not familiar with Homer's work, you have been warned. So the Odyssey is written and directed by Christopher Nolan. The man doesn't need much more of an introduction than that. He has made some of the biggest films over the past 20 years. He has an incredible catalogue of films, and he is now also an Oscar winner. The film stars Matt Damon as Odysseus, Tom Holland as Telemachus, Anne Hathaway as Penelope, Robert Pattinson as Antonius, Elliot Page as Sinon, John Leguizamo as Eumaeus, Ryan Hurst as Mentor, Benny Safdie as Agamemnon, Charlize Theron as Calypso, Zendaya as Athena, John Bernthal as Menelaus, Samantha Morton as Circe, and Lupita Nyong'o as Helen of Troy and Clytemnestra. This film review is going to be solely based on my opinion of the film. I'll be relating it heavily back to the book. But for me, the source material is everything. It's not an easy job to translate any of Homer's work into a movie. The Odyssey especially is a very hard story to try to put on the big screen. It's even harder to try to fit it into a window that's less than 5 hours. The source material is the benchmark, obviously, for any version or interpretation of the Odyssey or the Iliad. The Iliad is more black and white, but the Odyssey is very ambiguous. It can be very hard to read and understand. The core foundation and message of the Odyssey is the lesson that it implies, or the logos. The Odyssey is designed to teach, not just entertain. At least that's how I see it anyway. Now, I'm not a Greek scholar by any means, but I do know a thing or two about history. I have been to Troy, all the archaeological ruins most associated with the former city of Troy. I went there in 2010. I've been to this area of the world, and I'm also a history nerd, and ancient Greece and ancient Rome are two of my favourite time periods to look into. Ancient Greece is absolutely fascinating. Is Nolan's film faithful to Homer's message and the lessons implied in it? Or has Nolan taken bits of Homer, modernized it, and then turned it into something completely different? Those are the core pillars I'll be basing my film review on. I'm not going to be looking at the film simply as, oh, it was a good film and entertained me, yada, yada, yada. If you want a modern movie reviewer's interpretation of the Odyssey, go right ahead and listen to something else, because I'll be looking at this through the lens of history, authenticity to Homer, and realism. I'll explain that in more detail a little later on. Now, Christopher Nolan has taken several creative liberties, well, more than several creative liberties in this film. And like all films, there's going to be parts you like and parts you don't. But besides his creative choices, Nolan has also pushed the envelope in terms of the technical approach to this film. He has relied heavily on practical effects over visual effects. He apparently made a real Cyclops puppet. He used real ships and shot the film entirely on IMAX, which I think is the first time that's ever been done, which is all well and good, but there's only 41, I think, cinemas globally. You can actually appreciate, quote-unquote, his vision on a 70mm IMAX screen. Most of the world doesn't have access to it, at least I don't anyway. There's only one cinema in Australia, which is in Melbourne, that has the ability to show an IMAX film in the 70mm. Now, personally, I think IMAX is a crock of shit. I think it's another gimmick to try to get people into the theatre. I don't think it really enhances the film all that much. I don't really need to see Matt Damon's or Elliot Page's face on a 5-story screen in ultra high resolution detail. I saw it at my local cinema yesterday at 12 p.m. They showed the film on the biggest theatre. The last couple of films I've seen have all been on smaller ones. But the screen, to my surprise, was more square than it was rectangle or letterbox. Now, I think they can expand the screen a bit more, because I've noticed that with other films. Some films are more, the aspect ratio is a bit different. Some films are a bit more letterbox, others are more square. And when I saw the first frames of the film, I thought, it's not IMAX, but you still get a sense that the film was shot in IMAX or a little different from a traditional film. And if you know anything about film history and cinema history, you'll know IMAX is not really that new. A lot of Westerns were shot on that big 70mm, 65mm, 70mm format. I mean, IMAX is obviously a modern version of that, and it's a bit different how it works, and it is more detailed, but The 70mm aspect ratio has been around for quite some time. Quentin Tarantino used, I think, 60 or 65mm vintage cameras to shoot The Hateful Eight. And personally, I think it's unnecessary. I don't think this film benefited greatly from it being in IMAX. And once again, I hadn't actually seen it in my IMAX, so maybe if I saw it on the 70mm, maybe my opinion would be changed. But I still got a sense of the scale and the scope that he was going for. The screen was a bit bigger. It didn't look like a traditional letterbox style film. It definitely had more height like I said, I saw it in a standard cinema. I don't think the cinema got a new screen, or if that was just how a big standard screen looks, and they can, like I said, they can change the aspect ratio. Because I saw Dune Part 2 in the same theater, and then I saw it in X-Max. It wasn't quite IMAX, but it's a similar format. It's a smaller format. And honestly, I didn't really notice a hell of a lot of difference. The only scene that really popped out in Dune 2 was the sandworms, the sandworm attack on the Sardaukar during the battle. So I don't feel like I lost too much of the scale and scope. So I don't feel like I have to go see this in IMAX or XMAX or whatever the closest thing is. And I heard an interview with Matt Damon recently saying you couldn't look at the other actor because the cameras were so big they'd block your eye line, so you had to use mirrors. And apparently they're so loud you can't actually hear the dialogue. The actors had a lot of trouble hearing each other, so they had to encase it in these soundproof boxes. And these cameras are huge. They're like the size of a small car. It just seems like it's a massive... Yeah, it might be cool and cutting edge on one hand, but it's also pretentious and creates a lot of more work for everybody. Because I think you could have told this story without the IMAX. The IMAX does add a little bit of scope to it, but I think it's really what he does with the scope that counts. And Nolan has a very unique artistic lens he sees the world. For instance, the scenes with the Trojan horse on the beach. There's basically a barren landscape, a white sandy landscape with this giant wooden horse sticking out of the sand on an angle, and that's in this big superimposed image with a very desolate background. He's done this a few times in his films, and I would really like to see him or another filmmaker use IMAX on a maximalist level with lots of detail in the background and really push the format to its absolute limit. Like shoot a film in the jungle so you can get all that depth of the green undergrowth and the trees and shrubs and things like that. It's a bit different when you're filming a rocky mountain or a desolate looking beach or a desert. You still get the scope, obviously, and what Denis did in Dune, he used IMAX in key scenes, not just filming the whole film with it. Because I don't think you need to have a dialogue conversation shot just in IMAX. But anyway, that's just my personal opinions on it, so no IMAX for me. The film begins with a dark screen and the line of a time of apparent magic. Now, this caused a lot of concern for me, because including the word apparent to me implies that this is somehow subversive. It suggests that the film is inviting the audience to question whether the supernatural is quote-unquote real within the story. And this is something that Homer never does. The supernatural world, the mythological world, whatever you want to call it, I'm going to call it the mythological world, was as real to the ancient Greeks as AI or iPhones, modern-day appliances, teapots, or Nike Jordan shoes, whatever material objects you want to use. It was as real for them as the most dominant religions on planet Earth right now. And Homer never makes a differentiation between the gods and mortal men. Homer's world is a time of men and gods, intertwined and interconnected. The gods interact with mortal humans, and there is no differentiation between a god interacting with Odysseus or Telemachus than you talking to your friend at a coffee shop. The supernatural is part of the story. I've heard a lot of modern film reviewers and film buffs refer to this film as fantasy. It is not fucking fantasy, it is mythology. And there's a big debate with the hardcore Homer and Odyssey aficionados saying there is not a lot of authenticity from what they've seen from the trailers. Then this should have been different, yada, yada, yada. And then the film people are like, oh no, it's only fantasy, you can change whatever he likes, you can do this, you can do that, yada, yada, yada. Within reason, because if you know anything about Greek mythology or philosophy, all mythology is tied to some truth. And that's the same with any type of mythological story from any culture that has ever existed. The myth or the story is a way of passing down the lesson to future generations. It's an easier way, a more accessible way to pass down a lesson that would otherwise be forgotten. Because ancient Greek mythology relied on two components, mythos and logos. So what is mythos and logos, if you're not familiar? Mythos obviously means myth, logos is reason. They are complementary ways of understanding reality. And this is something the Greeks and other cultures used to understand the world around them and to pass down stories with lessons attached to them. Logos represents the factual or the logical and scientific thought used for practical problem solving. So in the case of the Odyssey, people are arguing, oh, it's a Cyclops, it's monsters, it's all this fantastical elements in the story, therefore reality doesn't need to apply. I argue that reality needs to apply more, because you can't sell the time period if the audience doesn't buy into it. And the Cyclops scene gets used quite a lot. People say, oh, this is a story with Cyclopses. Yes, but it's still a story set in a very real time period, the late Bronze Age in ancient Greece. There are some things you can play with and there's some things you can't. But the other problem is people are overlooking, especially the modern film reviewers who aren't familiar with the source material, look at the monsters and say, oh, this is this fantastical journey. They tell the audience a very specific lesson, which I'll get into later in the review and on future installments. Now, mythos relies on narratives, symbols, and stories, which provide the psychological comfort and answer deeper questions about the meaning of life, suffering, and death. And that's what Homer does brilliantly. And if you do get into mythology, especially ancient Greek mythology, you see these tenets of the story reoccur. Homer is very ambiguous sometimes. He can leave a lot of things out. I noticed that first time I read Homer, when I read the Iliad, the gods interact with humans like they're in the same room as them. There's a lot of weird phrasing of words, and obviously this is 3,000 years ago these stories were first written. The Odyssey is more ambiguous than the Iliad. The Iliad is very black and white. It's very good versus evil and the consequences of living such a life. Hector is good, Achilles is this anti-hero, the Greeks represent the bad. There's a lot you can learn from those stories, and they are two of the founding pillars of Stoic philosophy. I'm pretty sure Stoic philosophy originated with the Greeks, but it was more popularized with the Romans later on. Now, the Odyssey is a far more ambiguous journey, but the lessons are still the same. The lessons don't really change. And when I first read it, there's a lot of weird shit in the book. A lot of things that don't make sense. You've got to read them a couple of times, and even then they still don't understand. They still don't make sense. Like there's a part in the book where they find the lotus eaters, and the men get addicted to this lotus flower. It's not overly explained. There's another part of the book where Odysseus gets literally a bag of wind, and it's like, what the fuck is Homer talking about? That he has this magic bag of wind, and when you see elements like that, they don't make a lot of sense out of context, and it's easy to see why people think this is just fantasy. But it's not. The message of Homer still needs to make it through all the mythological aspects of the story, the action, Cyclopses, the giants, whirlpools, and monsters. And when people say, oh, this is just fantasy, it doesn't, Nolan can do whatever he likes. No, he can't, because he needs to stick within those same boundaries. Because if you change a couple of little things here and there, it does change the overall message, the core of the story. The people who say it's fantasy clearly have never read the book, or if they have, they're not really taking the message that Homer is trying to weave throughout this story. And a time of apparent magic really did raise a lot of red flags for me, because is Christopher Nolan telling the audience that he's subverting Homer? Is he telling the audience that, quote unquote, this is a time of apparent magic, not mythology? And as I mentioned before, is he inviting the audience to question whether the supernatural is actually real within the story? Because this is something that Homer does not do. There is no definition, there is no differentiation between the supernatural and the real world. They're one and the same. Because in Homer, Athena is Athena, Poseidon is Poseidon, Hermes is Hermes, the gods intervene in human affairs. There is nothing unusual about Athena interacting with Telemachus or Odysseus or anyone else for that matter. Prophecy, sacrifice, and divine justice are part of the fabric of reality within Homer's Odyssey. The poem doesn't ask, did this really happen? It asks, what does this mean? And that's the real beauty of Homer's work and why it has lasted for thousands of years. There's been millions of stories that have come and gone over the millennia, but Homer's stories have lasted the test of time. They're still relevant today as they were 3,500 years ago, and it's why those stories have transcended this massive amount of time, because of the meaning applied to them. Now we fast forward to 2026 and Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. We have this mythos versus modern realism. And one thing Nolan has done throughout his career, he has reinvented myths through contemporary lenses. If we think about the Dark Knight trilogy, Batman becomes less of a gothic mythic figure and more of a psychologically grounded vigilante operating in a very realistic and recognizable world. Some people love that approach, others did not. Others feel it strips away what makes Batman Batman. And to a degree, Nolan does subvert the Bruce Wayne story in the Dark Knight trilogy. He makes him more of a playboy. He gives him multiple personalities in a way. There's the public playboy wanker Bruce Wayne. There's Bruce Wayne when he's with Alfred, Bruce Wayne when he's with Rachel, and other individuals in the story. And then there's the other alter ego of Batman. And that's very different to other versions of Batman that we have seen over the years. I don't think any version's right or wrong, and look, I love the Dark Knight trilogy. It's, I think, one of the best interpretations of Batman, but it still is an interpretation. And some people like it. Batman purists might have a couple of issues with what Nolan did, but Batman had been around for a very long time. There had been multiple theatrical versions of it. The last couple sucked pretty badly, and we've already seen more or less the same version of the Batman story told over and over again. There was a Michael Keaton Batman, and there was Val Kilmer, George Clooney, and while those are still part of really the same series of films, and Nolan's Batman comes years after the George Clooney Batman kind of ruined things, and it restarts the Dark Knight in this realistic and gritty and grounded world. And I think that's what Batman needed at the time. Then the Zack Snyder Batman went more of the classic cliched route, and Robert Pattinson's Batman is just doing something completely different. And I really did like how that film skipped all the backstory, then went straight to year 2 of Batman being Batman. It's more about Batman than it is about Bruce Wayne. Now, you could argue he's done something similar with the Odyssey, not because he's trying to be disrespectful, but because that's simply how he tells his stories. And for me, everything comes back to Homer's benchmark. Every adaptation has the freedom to reinterpret a classic. I mean, it wouldn't really be artistic if it wasn't interpreted by the artist. But because Homer created the work, Homer's poem remains the benchmark against which every adaptation is measured. But this brings up a very hard question. Can you modernize the Odyssey without changing its worldview? Or does changing its worldview inevitably create a completely different story? If Nolan replaces a cosmos governed by God's fate and ritual with one centered on psychology, trauma, and human agency, then the audience isn't simply watching Homer's Odyssey on screen, they're watching Christopher Nolan's interpretation of Homer's Odyssey. That's not necessarily a criticism in itself, but it does bring up a real question, whether or not the reinterpretation preserves what made the original endure for nearly 3 millennia, or whether it creates something that stands on its own terms. And I think that's worth looking at. A Time of Apparent Magic, to me anyway, comes off like Nolan is viewing this world as a magical or fantastical world rather than a mythological one. The film starts with a very dark and moody introduction into the world of Greek mythology, or should I say, Nolan's interpretation of Greek mythology. Now, one of the first characters we're introduced to is the bard Telemachus, played by Travis Scott. I mean, really, Travis fucking Scott? And I get the point that Nolan's trying to make. As he said in interviews in the past, oral poetry is analogous to rap. Yeah, there are some similarities there for sure, but he's a completely different character in this version than he was in the book. I think he's the bard for the Phoenician king and doesn't really have much of a role to play in it. And I can understand why he did put a musician or a rapper in it. I just don't think Travis Scott was the best choice he could have made, because that, by definition, you're saying only a rapper can play a bard because it's analogous to old poetry and rap or whatever the argument happens to be. But then you've subverted other roles later on in the film. But by that definition, shouldn't you cast a man to play a man? Just something to think about. That are some of the biggest criticisms of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey, is some of his creative casting choices, because they're not always logical, and frankly, they're not all that good. The casting in this film across the board is questionable. I'll get into that later in the episode. I mean, Travis Scott's role wasn't very big. He's only in the film for, maybe under a minute maybe, something like that. It was an interesting way to start this story, because you have Travis Scott playing the bard who is recounting the Song of Troy. He's telling a packed palace full of suitors this tale about Odysseus and the Trojan War. Penelope sits weaving behind this semi-see-through wall, and we get a very quickly edited together kind of a montage of the past and present colliding. There's some quick flashbacks of a wooden horse on a beach, the Trojans, Telemachus, and we're kind of dropped into this whirlpool of the past and present colliding. So from there, we're dropped into the Trojan War. And unlike the book, the Trojan War doesn't really appear until, I think, chapter 5. The book starts off where Athena visits Telemachus. I was wondering before I saw the film, how is he going to start it? Is he going to start it in the Trojan War, or is he going to start with more of a backstory? Because the first 4 chapters of the book do drag on a little bit. Odysseus doesn't come into it until chapter 5, and there is a lot of build-up and backstory that takes place prior to Odysseus really becoming the central character of the story. Telemachus plays a massive part in the first couple of chapters, as well as Athena. So I was wondering, how was he going to pull this off? Because I think theatrically it makes more sense to start with the Trojan War. Otherwise you don't really get where Odysseus has come from, and I don't think you really care or connect with him as much as if the Trojan War was just a flashback through the middle of the film. And this brings us to one of the most ridiculous scenes in the film. The Trojan horse half sunk in the sand on the beaches of Troy. And that wasn't the most ridiculous part either, because we get the first scenes of Elliot Page in the film, and this has caused massive controversy. There was rumours she was playing Achilles, which really makes absolutely no fucking logical or creative sense. You literally have a man with no balls playing an ancient Greek warrior. So what is Nolan trying to say about ancient Greek warriors? Because it makes absolutely no fucking sense why you would cast Elliot Page in this role, unless it is just to piss people off. I have no problem with trans people. I just want authenticity in a film that is set in ancient Greece. And look, if Elliot Page was 6'4" and had a beard, yeah, cool. You would look more authentic. He is a very petite individual. And as we all know, Elliot Page used to be Ellen Page. Ellen Page was 5'1" and 106 pounds. Now you're trying to play an ancient Greek warrior who's wearing armour that probably weighed around 30, maybe 35 to 40 pounds, with a 1.5 pound sword, bronze sword, and bronze is heavy. So in reality, they wouldn't be able to wear the armour. And this scene is so ridiculous because you see her running across the beach, across the sand, trying to run like a man, and it was jarring. I was completely taken out of it because I'm not thinking, oh, this is an actor playing a Greek warrior. I'm thinking this is Elliot Page more or less pretending to be a man trying to play a male warrior. And just a face too, because I'm the same age as Elliot Page and she looks like she's 57. Whatever the fuck happened to her after that surgery has completely, obviously it's completely changed them, because that was the entire point, I guess. But whatever happened to them appears to be so traumatic, it has left literal scars on their face, because Elliot Page looks like Bern Gorman. And I'm talking about the sunken in cheeks with those big age lines. Elliot Page has really dead, lifeless looking eyes compared to Ellen Page. This is not an individual that looks happy with themselves. And yeah, I mean, I guess it's their choice at the end of the day, but I don't agree with the way Elliot Page has gone about things. Yeah, if that's who you are, okay, whatever. But you've done it on such a narcissistic level. You've put this shit out on Instagram so you can get 1 million likes from other disillusioned young people around the world, rather than stop and say, hey, this worked for me, but it might not work for you. You're perpetuating more issues than you're trying to solve. And then you come out in the press, you've copped criticism, and rightfully so, because it makes no fucking sense why Elliot Page was cast in this film at all. You come out and criticize people who criticize you as being bigots. If you are making a piece of art, it has the right to be criticized. You can criticize my views on this podcast and my thoughts on the film. I don't fucking care. Go for it. I'll criticize you fucking back. It's my opinion. Elliot Page has faced backlash because it doesn't make any fucking sense why they're in the film in the first place. And look, I think Elliot Page's performance in this film, for the time that they actually have in it, they're only in it for about 4.5 minutes. I thought Elliot Page's performance was actually pretty good. Maybe they would have been suited better to play another character like Hephaestus or someone like that, who is smaller in stature, because it doesn't, from a physical standpoint, it doesn't make any sense why you would cast someone who is so petite in the role of a male Greek warrior. And when you look at the other casting choices in the film too, especially I'm focusing just on the Greek warriors and Trojan warriors, Odysseus' crew, they're all very able, very rugged-looking individuals, men, basically. Matt Damon's jacked. All the crew are jacked. They look like they at least have done some training with a bronze sword or some rowing. Then you have this ridiculous scene of Elliot Page running across the sand, standing in front of the Trojan horse, playing a character called Sinon, who isn't even in the Odyssey or the Iliad. Sinon is not a creation of Homer at all. Sinon is a character from the Aeneid by Virgil. Virgil was a Roman poet from the Augustan period, around 70 to 19 BC. He wrote the Aeneid, which was a national epic of Rome, which chronicles the legendary founding of the city by Trojan hero Aeneas. Aeneas is one of the survivors of the Trojan War who travels to Italy and sets up the first major city. I'm pretty sure I've got that book. I think I covered it. I think I had to get it for uni, I think. Can't remember. But anyway, Sinon is a creation of Virgil, and Nolan has taken this character of Sinon. He's pretty much replaced Achilles. Achilles doesn't play a huge part in the Odyssey, but he does have a very central appearance in it later on. Now, did he take Sinon just to make this symmetrical story about the Trojan War? Because we all know Christopher Nolan loves symmetrical filmmaking and storytelling. So the Trojan horse is stuck in the sand. It's on this weird angle. Sinon sees a group of Trojans approaching and runs in front of the horse before putting the helmet on, and then getting nailed to the Trojan horse by arrows. 2 Trojans approach. One lifts Sinon's head up with a sword and is going to kill them before they're stopped by the other Trojan in command. Now, Sinon is supposed to be this character that gets left behind in order to manipulate the Trojans to bring the Trojan horse into the city. Sinon, in a way, is like a human representation of the Trojan horse. They're a master manipulator and deceiver, which when you look at it from another angle, from more of an anti-woke angle, maybe Elliot Page was a good casting choice, because Elliot Page has been pretty manipulative and deceitful. The character of Sinon gets captured by the Trojans and convinces the Trojans to bring the horse into the city. Then tells the Trojans this sob story that they got left behind by the Greeks, and they were meant to be a sacrifice for a safe journey home, and that they were abandoned on the beach, or something along those lines. So I can kind of understand why Nolan would include a character like that. I can't really forgive him for the very poor choice of casting Sinon. And that's the other problem. Why the fuck is the horse stuck in the sand? I had massive problems with his interpretation of the Trojan horse. The Trojan horse looks like it was crafted by artisans. It looks like Michelangelo made it, and not a group of bored soldiers making a wooden horse out of spare bits of wood from the boats that were either burned or damaged, because that's essentially how Homer describes it, or how other ancient historians have described the creation of the horse, is the wood from ships of the dead. So these are obviously the boats, the ships that crews had been killed, or they've condensed the crews onto other ships, and they had all these ships with no one to sail them back. So they used that wood to create the horse. Makes sense from a logical standpoint, from a logos standpoint. It doesn't make any sense why the Trojan horse was just made in the position it is. It's made in this like rearing up position. Yeah, it looks cool from a artistic standpoint, but from a logical standpoint, with what these guys could have made with the resources they had, it doesn't make any fucking sense. And it's also like sinking in the sand, which is even dumber, because the next scene is Odysseus telling us that they were in the horse for 2 days, many men drowned from the surf. It's like, well, no fucking shit, the horse is sinking in the fucking sand. The tide's coming in, it would have killed anyone in that waterline, which is like, why the fuck would you do that? It's Odysseus or Menelaus that says it. They were in this horse for 2 days, stacked on top of each other, covered in each other's piss and shit. From a realistic standpoint, they all would have suffocated and died. They would have died of dehydration, or they would have been boiled by the fucking heat. It makes far more sense to build the horse on wheels or on a platform, so it's at least up vertically. It would have given you more space to hide more soldiers, and made it a hell of a lot harder to have someone put a sword or a spear through the horse. And then the next scene is the Trojans dragging the horse on rollers out of the sand. Now, all that movement, all that being knocked around would have killed half the people in the horse anyway if the dehydration or drowning didn't get them. It just seems like Nolan was being way too artistically pretentious and not really thinking, maybe that doesn't make sense from a realistic standpoint. And I am obsessed with realism and being faithful to source material. While you could have made the horse on a platform rearing up, that would have also been cool. To have it half sunk in the sand like that, I think is really fucking stupid. It also tells me that Nolan is trying to solve a problem. The Trojans don't just merely find Sinon and then find this horse, because they more or less just kill Sinon not too long after, which isn't really touched upon further. There's a scene later in the film where a spear or an arrow goes through the Trojan horse right next to Odysseus, which is obviously Sinon getting killed, because Sinon doesn't know that the horse is full of Greeks. They couldn't trust Sinon with that information or something like that. And 10 points for the Trojan archer, who could actually fire an arrow on horseback and nail one of Elliot Page's very scrawny arms to the horse. It's not a big target you're shooting at. And that's another ridiculous thing, is Elliot Page is running with his armor, with his sword, and their arms are fucking tiny. So it's not even believable that this person could pick up a sword or armor. I wasn't buying in that much because it was so unrealistic. So anyway, the Trojan horse is getting dragged into the city by ropes, and yeah, I did not like it. To be honest, I just thought it should have been on rollers or something. Yeah, well, why that's been done before, it makes fucking sense. Dragging the horse on its side, I thought was just stupid. The horse is just, yeah, I don't know. The scene when they're passing reeds to the guys in the bottom of the horse who are fucking drowning was just like, what the fuck? Like, what did you think was going to happen? If you make it on the beach, it's going to get stuck in the sand. And someone on Twitter said something, I saw this on a YouTube video. He pointed out that Nolan is approaching the Odyssey from a standpoint of trying to solve problems, one being the horse stuck in the sand. The Trojans are trying to free it and save it. And this is months before the film came out. But I think this guy was right, because it does seem like he is trying to solve problems in this film rather than trying to explain the mythology, because this happens a couple of other times throughout the film. It's a problem to solve rather than a myth or a symbol to uphold. We flash back to Ithaca and the suitors, and we get introduced to Penelope and Telemachus and the sorry state of Odysseus' palace in his absence. The suitors have overrun the palace. Antonius, or Antinous, played by Robert Pattinson, is the worst offender, and the other suitor, played by Corey Hawkins. They basically want Telemachus out of the way so they can have a chance at marrying the mother and inheriting Telemachus' inheritance and Odysseus' wealth. Now, the palace scenes are so fucking dark. It just seems to be like a symptom of a lot of modern films. Everything is so dark, you can't see any of the color or the detail. Like, so I know it's night and it's a huge palace and there's a lot of lanterns and a lot of torches around the place that's essentially lit by flame. But I would have thought there would have been a lot more light. There would have been some giant windows of some type because it's built on the coast. I can't imagine the Greeks would be sitting there eating in the dark. It just got annoying because I'm so sick of seeing this, especially in ancient films. Everything is just so dark and bland. It's not the ancient Greek world. The ancient world was bright and colourful. And this is really let down because you can see that red terracotta coloured paint on the walls of Odysseus' palace, which was apparently actually real because they did find traces of that paint in ruins on Ithaca that are associated with Odysseus. I just don't know why Hollywood likes to make the ancient world so drab and boring. I think it comes from this viewpoint that the ancient world, well, what we know of the ancient world is basically ruins. So they think, oh, well, they couldn't have had colour or any type of artistic goal, even though they did create some of the world's best art. There's this arrogance from modern people that think bygone eras were either primitive or not as sophisticated as the modern day. If you look at anything in the modern day, look at how colourful everything is. Look how people customise their cars, bright, bold colours. Why wouldn't the ancients be any different? Every time you see an ancient film and there's a statue, it's always this monochrome colour. It's just basically whatever colour the rock was, which is not true because we know that the ancients used to paint and decorate statues to make them look realistic. Some of the statues even had real jewelry and clothing. They weren't just carved pieces of marble. Now, it's during the start of this film, there's lots of flashbacks from past and present. The past and present are colliding, and that is a central theme of this film. And it wasn't really surprising because Nolan loves to play with time, and I was thinking to myself when I heard he was making this film, why is he making the Odyssey? Apparently he had the opportunity to direct Troy 20 years ago, but lost out to Wolfgang Petersen, and he's wanted to make an Odyssey film since then, and now he's finally got his chance. But when I started reading the Odyssey again a couple of months ago, I thought, okay, this is why Nolan is attracted to this story, because the Odyssey isn't linear. It does play with time quite a bit. There's Telemachus' story, Odysseus' story. Odysseus is telling stories from the past and what happened to him and the crew when he goes to the Phoenician king. So I can understand why he was attracted to it, that concepts of time element that Nolan loves to play with. Now, there's a couple of nice scenes here with flashbacks to life before the war on Ithaca. There's a touching scene where we're introduced to Argos, Odysseus' faithful hunting dog. Eumaeus is basically chunking the runt puppies over the cliff, which is something Spartans used to do with newborns, apparently. And while that does seem shocking, we have to remind ourselves this is the ancient world. This is what life was like back then. But he's about to chuck his puppy over the cliff, and Odysseus grabs him, and this is the first real introduction to Matt Damon as Odysseus. He grabs him and he says, no, I want to keep this one. Eumaeus says, for the boy. Odysseus replies, no, for a hunting dog. And this intersects with another cool scene of Mentor, played by Ryan Hurst, Opie, Sons of Anarchy, training Telemachus to fight. Eumaeus, who is the swineherd, he's a loyal servant to Odysseus. He also appears to be in the film an amalgamation of Odysseus' father. Odysseus' father is blind and dies just before Odysseus returns home. And Eumaeus, the most loyal servant of Odysseus, because in ancient Greece, especially in this story, you had multiple different servants. You had the housemaids and the queen's servants. You had people who cooked. Then you had other servants who were in charge of livestock like cattle and swine. Eumaeus is the swineherd. He's not blind in the book, I am pretty sure. So Nolan has kind of amalgamated two different characters into the one. They've also made him a lot older, I think, in the film than he is in the book. Odysseus' father is not in it, and that was a bit of a shock. I don't quite understand why he took him out of it, because he does play... It's not a huge part in the story, but it is still important. Every character in the Odyssey and the Iliad has an important role, no matter how minor it is. So it does surprise me that he did cut Odysseus' father out of it. And unfortunately, I did find the intro a little pretentious in parts. It was almost like Nolan is self-aware that he has taken Homer's Odyssey and kind of made it a Christopher Nolan film. I thought the horse was very pretentiously artistic. We get another flashback to Troy, and we get a real good look at what the Trojans look like, or Nolan's interpretation of what Trojans look like, and they look like the fucking elves from Lord of the Rings. They're wearing these Corinthian-style Spartan helmets, which I'm 98% sure the Trojans, if they were real, and I do think they were, did not wear, because that is a very Greek-style helmet, the Spartan helmet. They're wearing this white and gold armour. They've got white leather skirts and this armour that is very angular and very modern looking. And the helmets have this weird pattern carved on it, like a star or something like that. And I did not like what he chose to make the Trojans look like. They looked like they should be from a fantasy film and not an ancient Greek film. And as hard as I tried to buy into what Nolan is selling, I kept getting pulled out of it because of these creative choices. Another thing that's very apparent early in the film is the age of Telemachus. He's described as being a man. In the book, he is about 20 years old. He's just come into being a man, and he wants to take his kingdom back. He knows his father's alive. He wants to go and find him. Every version of Telemachus I've seen is a bit different. I watched The Return on the weekend, and Telemachus is kind of a whiny, over-the-top young man. I did think Tom Holland was probably too old. Tom Holland's 34, playing a 32, whatever he is, playing a 20-year-old. But I was skeptical about Tom Holland, but he actually really did surprise me because he can be very bland in films. He's really just Tom Holland being Tom Holland. And that is some of the problem with the cast of this film is they're the same cast we've seen in pretty much every film this year. How many films has Zendaya, Tom Holland, and Robert Pattinson been in? Zendaya's, I think, in like every major film this year. If you can hear something on the recording, it's just started pouring with the rain where I am, so I do apologise for that. So this brings up the question of Telemachus' age, because in the book, Odysseus leaves and goes to war when he's a newborn. Telemachus never knows his father, which implies that he is a baby at the time when Odysseus leaves and doesn't remember his father at all. And there's this kind of rushed, like chopped up, edited intro to Telemachus and Odysseus when, right before Odysseus leaves for the war, it's the last time Penelope and Odysseus are together before he does leave. It creates this very inconsistent and ambiguous timeline because there's scenes where Odysseus is holding what looks like a toddler. And it's that classic Nolan trope where he tries to convey emotion by shooting characters from behind so you don't really see the kid's face. It's all very ambiguous, like someone is kind of watching this play out, and it's slow-mo and there's no dialogue. He uses the same thing in Inception. This didn't really work for me because Telemachus is not supposed to have known his father. He can't remember him. And I think if he was a toddler, he would have remembered Odysseus. Even though he's like 1 or 2 years old. I think he's 2 because he's got quite a lot of hair. He looks like an older kid. I think he's walking. And there's a scene with Penelope and Odysseus right before he leaves. And you see him sleeping on this bed on the floor. Now, one thing I did forget to mention, just before I get too ahead of myself, when Telemachus is getting hassled by the suitors, a beggar arrives because beggars had the right to enter the palace and seek food or money. A big theme in the book and also in actual real Greek culture was hospitality. Now, the ancient Greeks had a term for this hospitality. It was called xenia. Now, xenia was a very strict code that was believed to have been handed down by Zeus. So if you defied this xenia, you were defying Zeus. Now, host duty was to provide food, drink, and bath and shelter before asking the guest's name or business. So if you were a beggar or a homeless person, you had every right to approach someone like Odysseus, go to his palace, and seek these things. Now, the guest's duty was to be respectful, do not abuse the host's generosity, and do not be a burden on the host. The host gave a guest a gift, a xenion, to seal their permanent bond and friendship. And this is very important in the Odyssey because the suitors essentially violate this sacred right of hospitality. They basically piss all over it. They abuse Odysseus's generosity. They're eating another man's food in another man's house, trying to court and fuck another man's wife, basically. And this angers the god, and in the book, this plays out in a very violent fashion. And in the ancient world, this is completely understandable why Odysseus pretty much slaughters everybody. And in mythology, there are some very clear examples of Xenia being broken. One from the Trojan War, where Paris broke Xenia by kidnapping Helen. He basically takes Menelaus, the host's wife, which triggers the Trojan War, obviously. And Odysseus encounters good Xenia from the Phoenicians. In the first half of the book, where he is telling his story, he basically goes from kingdom to kingdom. He's always treated very well. Same where Telemachus goes to Sparta to see Menelaus. Menelaus is very welcoming. The Odyssey also contains some very horrific violations of this. The Cyclops eating his men and the suitors destroying his home. In Bacchus, or however it's pronounced, and Philemon, the elderly couple who unwillingly housed a disguised Zeus and Hermes, they are awarded with survival while the rich neighbours were doomed in a flood for refusing the gods' shelter. The Romans also had their own version of this called Hospitabum, however it's pronounced. Now, this is a large part of the book. It's also mentioned several times in the film. In the scene where Telemachus greets this beggar, he takes the beggar, he gives him food and wine, he's talking to him, he's asking about his father and if he knows anything about Odysseus or his crew, or what happened to him, because Telemachus asks any visitor or new face about his father, or if he can get any type of information about him. This beggar cops a lot of shit from Corey Hawkins' character and from Antonius. They just see him as a dirty beggar. They don't treat him very respectfully. To which Telemachus replies, "You should watch your manners because that might be a god in disguise." And that plays a huge part of the book. The gods are always disguising themselves as beggars or vagrants, and those that are nice to them and hospitable get rewarded. Those don't are pretty brutally punished. And this scene in the book, Athena disguises herself as a beggar. She comes to the palace and contacts Telemachus, has this plan that he's supposed to go out onto this quest and go find his father. She puts the whole rest of the story into motion pretty much. And that scene is in the film. It's kind of ambiguous whether this is Athena or not. I don't think it is. I think it's literally just a beggar, which is a little disappointing because Telemachus doesn't really interact with Athena in this film, unlike the book where she is pretty much one of the main characters. She is the guide for both Odysseus and Telemachus. Getting back to this scene before Odysseus leaves, so it's kind of ambiguous to how old Telemachus is at the time when Odysseus leaves. The scene with Odysseus and Penelope is one of the more emotional scenes of the film, and unfortunately this film doesn't really have a lot of emotion in it, despite the very dramatic events that take place. So this is the last time they're together. She gives him this gold brooch, which is the first trinket, which is another Christopher Nolan trope he likes to use. A lot of his films, characters have some type of physical identifier that ties them back to the world or to a character, like the spinning top trinket from Inception, the Batman Ninja Star things from The Dark Knight, certain items from Tenet that characters interact with in the past or the future, whatever. She says to him she wants him to wear the brooch so he will remember her and remember to come home, or something along those lines. From there, we go back to the beaches of Troy and we get our first introduction to Agamemnon, also known as Agamemnon. And the jumping back and forth between past and present, while it's an interesting way to tell a story, it did get a little bit annoying, because we're constantly jumping back and forth from the past in Troy to the present. And Telemachus' journey is pretty faithful to the book, I will say, especially at the start of it. It does follow the book quite closely. The Trojan stuff, like the timing of that is just so all over the place, because we're introduced to Troy with the horse in the sand, and now we're going back even further where the Greeks have kind of had a stalemate with the Trojans, and this is where Odysseus comes up with the idea of the horse. And this is the first time we get introduced to Agamemnon, and I will say Agamemnon's armor looks absolutely fucking ridiculous. It looks like fucking Batman. It looks like a combination of Batman and some type of fantastical bullshit some 18-year-old printed out on a 3D printer. I didn't like the angular helmet. It looks too computer made. The all black armor too would have been hot. It was stupid. Agamemnon is described as a larger-than-life character in the Iliad. He's described by King Priam as being broader than other men, but a head shorter than some of the taller characters in the book. So he's this larger-than-life character. So, yeah, I guess from a theatrical point, him towering over people does look good. It gets very pretentious when he's walking and Odysseus is behind him, and he literally just turns around like he's just on some type of a turntable, and Odysseus bows to him. It was pretentious. But what I really didn't like is Nolan is trying to make Agamemnon like this fucking superhero character, and I thought it was ridiculous. It doesn't really match the other Greeks. Everyone else is wearing like browns and very drab colors, and he's wearing black and gold. Yeah, I know he's supposed to be the king, but it didn't look like it was from the Bronze Age. It looked far more modern than that. For the first part of the film, at least, Agamemnon doesn't even speak. You never really see his face. You see kind of a reflection of eyes through the helmet. He's always wearing this ridiculous fucking armour. And while it's still the start of the film, another problem was also really apparent, and that is the dialogue. The dialogue is really fucking jarring, and one of the most distracting parts of this film was the accents. Now, some of the creative casting decisions and the race-swapped characters, a huge deal is being made about them prior to the film being released, but they don't really have a huge amount to play in the film. It's not like Helen or the Bard or Sinon have huge roles. They're only really, altogether, they probably only make up maybe 8 to 9 minutes of the film. The most irritating part of this film was the dialogue, the modern use of dialogue, I should say, and the accents. Everyone has an American accent, and it's frankly fucking annoying. Because just when you're starting to get into the story, and there's a lot of lines in the film that have been taken from the book, they're very poetic. So Matt Damon will be saying something in a very poetic way, and then you just get reminded of that Boston accent, and it completely takes you out of it. Like, I didn't know Odysseus was from downtown Boston. And it makes even less sense why Nolan did this, because you have British actors putting on American accents to play ancient Greeks. There's so many levels of fuckery and non-logical, nonsensical decision-making in this film. It makes it very hard to take seriously. Am I watching a $300 million quote-unquote epic film about ancient Greece and one of the greatest stories ever told? Or am I watching a $300 million high school play version of whatever was found lying around in the fucking drama room? The American accents, I think, were the biggest criticism of this film. They were just fucking annoying. Everyone has an American accent. Yeah, and while there is a debate, and a huge debate in that, people are saying, oh, they should have at least Mediterranean accents, or they should do this. I think if you're going to make a movie that is based in the ancient world, stock standard, it should be the neutral British accent, or a slight Shakespearean accent like they did in Troy. It keeps everybody on the same page. It's a Western movie, after all, made for a Western audience. And if you wanted to be even more authentic, I think, yeah, you could probably try to do it in Greek with subtitles, but I don't think that works quite well for a Western audience. And this is a Western story made by a Western production company with a Western director and mostly Western actors. So you can make the argument that English is probably the most logical decision in terms of the language. Now, if we look at other historical films and TV shows that have been made, Braveheart, everyone had a Scottish accent, and yeah, while the Scots do speak English, you have to give actors 10 points for at least attempting to do an accent, at least getting out of their comfort zone and trying to be more authentic. Actors do cop shit because an accent isn't right, but I give any actor 10 points for attempting to do an accent. And in Vikings, the cast is mostly Australian, British, Irish, and Canadian, yet they do try to put on a Nordic, Scandinavian-sounding accent. And I heard a good explanation for that on a YouTube video. I can't remember which one. I've watched too many lately. The reason they do this, as the guy explains, is so that the audience can buy into the world and the characters they're playing. And the viewer can now understand these characters speaking English, but they are buying into the authenticity with the accents. I don't think I explained that very well, but it more or less it implies that the audience can understand a foreign language, even though they're speaking English, as long as they do an accent. Where I think in this, the accents are so jarring, it does completely take you out of the viewing experience and reminds you that you're not actually watching a film set in ancient Greece. You're watching actors, some Americans, some British, trying to play ancient Greeks who are speaking in American accents, which is kind of the universal language in this world, but are in a period film. It's very fucking jarring, and it's kind of confusing why Nolan did that. Because I think that is one of the biggest criticisms of the film, that and some of the costumes. So then we go back to the suitors. Robert Pattinson is great at being a prick. You just fucking hate Antonius as soon as you meet him. And the scene at the table where Telemachus confronts them, and then he gets into a fight with Corey Hawkins' character, Menelaus, I think that's how you pronounce his name. He's kicking Argos under the table. This guy is an absolute piece of shit. He's in another man's house eating his food, kicking his elderly dog. You just fucking hate these people as soon as you're introduced to them, and they don't have a lot of screen time before you really completely hate them. And that's consistent with all versions of the story I've seen. You have to hate these suitors immediately because there's a lot of them. And then they bully Telemachus. They're coming up with this plot to try to kill him so they can get to the mother. It's a very bizarre and dangerous situation that Telemachus has found himself in. And right off the bat, you just hate the fucking suitors. And while Nolan only focuses on a handful of them, because there are about 100 of them, I think there's 106 in the book. Not all of them are mentioned individually, but there's the main players. And there's a split faction of servants that are loyal to Odysseus and Penelope, and ones that are sleeping with suitors and feeding them the information. Another one of Nolan's creative choices that I really didn't like was the use of modern language and the whole modernizing the story to fit modern language in a quote-unquote modern audience. I didn't like the inclusion of modern language. It didn't fit. It made it feel clunky and stupid. Not every use of modern language was annoying, but there were some scenes that definitely stood out more than others. In the first scene with Telemachus and Antonius is one of the best examples of very jarring, very distracting modern language. Telemachus says to Antonius, "My dad's coming back." And Antonius says, you're just a sniveling bastard pining for a daddy. It was just stupid, and it sounds really fucking corny. Even if it doesn't relate to the book at all, it's corny, and it just takes the seriousness of the scene away, because how am I meant to believe these two characters that are both talking with American accents who have just said daddy in the same sentence? And one of the first lines Telemachus says is, "My dad's coming home." Kind of takes you out of it. A much better line would have been, "My father is coming home," or "Ithaca's king will return." It's more serious, it's more dramatic, and essentially that's what the film is. It's very dramatic. It's being billed as this big, epic, dramatic film, yet the language really does it injustice, and so does the dialogue. You combine the dialogue, the language, and the American accents, and it completely takes you out of the scene. It reminds you that you're not watching a story set in ancient Greece. You're watching a contemporary, modernized version of a story that was set in ancient Greece. And that really shouldn't have been the point, because these aspects counteract the time and effort that has gone into making the film. It's a creative choice that I don't get. I don't understand why Nolan did this, because it does come off as corny and immature in a lot of the dialogue scenes. And if you compare other historical films that have kept American accents, none of them are really taken seriously today. They're all being forgotten. And I don't think it was a good choice for a film you want to be relevant in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time. From there, we flash back to the beaches of Troy. The Greeks have won the war and are headed home. And this is where Odysseus' Odyssey really begins. And it's a fair way into the film. I think it's about 45 minutes into it. Definitely more than half an hour, I think. The start of the film has quite a long build-up, which I'm not surprised, because I think it's really the only way to tell this story. The book takes about 4 chapters to get going, and we're not really introduced in... Odysseus really doesn't play a huge part until about chapter 5, when he starts to recount the journey home. But so far, the start of the film has been very choppy. The past and present have collided. There's been lots of flashbacks and cutscenes. Nolan does do this quite a lot in his films. He has a lot of choppy, nearly hurried, edited together scenes. So it wasn't really a surprise, because this is the way he does tell his stories. There's a lot of One scene here, then we're back here, then we're here, then we're back there. And now it's the Trojan War, and now we're back to the palace, and now we're here, and now it's the Trojan War. There's a lot of that very choppy, fast kind of editing, and it takes about 30 or so minutes for this film to really settle. But once Odysseus hits the waters with his crew and his ships, the film slows down, the pacing changes, and it becomes nearly a different film. It's a bit more of an adventure film. We've had all this dark, dramatic plot building and world creation, and now we're finally getting into the heart of the Odyssey. So Odysseus and his men are on the high seas, making their way back to Ithaca. They see Agamemnon's ship going in and following the trade routes. Odysseus mentions he's got more mouths to feed. Odysseus is going to take another way home. It's a slightly longer way, but he says to the crew, we'll still get home in good time, probably get home before Agamemnon, but we'll also get to see some of the world as well. These are the first scenes we get where we see Odysseus as an adventurer and not just a military general. I think these scenes in particular were a really good interpretation of Odysseus. Odysseus here is much more like Homer's Odysseus. He's got more of a sense of an adventure. He wants to go home, but at the same time, he's not in really any rush to go home. He's been at war for 10 years. He wants to take the scenic route and have a bit more fun on the way home and put the past 10 years behind him. Now, the other problem with this scene is in the book, and the general consensus is that Odysseus has about 600 men in 12 ships, which would be 50 men per ship. Odysseus in the film has one large ship and two smaller ships, and I swear the number of his crew just keeps changing. Like half of them are in one ship. You don't really get a good look at the other two ships. Some scenes it appears like he has 200 men, others it's about 50, sometimes it's 100. A bunch will get killed, but it's not always clear how many men he has or how many remain. From here we get some more brief backstory scenes of Odysseus in Ithaca, hunting and training the boys how to hunt, one of which is Antonius. He mentions that he used to hunt with Odysseus when he was a boy, and this is where the bow comes into it. Odysseus is a hunter, he uses a bow, he plucks the string and it sounds like a harp, pretty much. We also get this draft lot scene where Agamemnon is gathering allies for his war against Troy. There's basically a draft system. There's a whole bunch of villagers lined up who they take this thing called a lot. It's basically like a little carved piece of wood or something. And once again, this is a second trinket that Nolan has put in the film because Nolan loves these trinkets. In other words, it's a fancy way of the shortest straw. Each person takes one of these lots. They're all different sizes. Whoever gets the short one ends up joining Odysseus. Whoever's got the long one stays behind to look after Ithaca. And once again, I'm referring to the book. This isn't mentioned in the book at all, but it was a cool addition. However, I think Nolan is focusing too much on the war side of things, and this is a trope a lot of Hollywood films seem to favor these days. There's always this focus on war. Everything is war. They always overlook philosophy and politics and even romance now in favor of war and action. Is Hollywood trying to tell us something? Are they trying to increase the numbers of people joining the army? I don't know. This scene also serves as a way of connecting the past with Sinon and Antonius. Sinon is Odysseus' cousin, I think, and I think he's also a relative of Antonius. Both of them are lined up next to each other. Antonius gets the short lot, but switches it with the unknowing Sinon. Sinon goes to war. Antonius stays at home and becomes the future's big threat. While this scene wasn't in the book, it does show you how life was back then, and maybe this is how armies were recruited. I'm not sure, but it did feel authentic to the time period. It also, I think, connects to that old saying, this is your lot in life. If you were the one that got the short straw, your future was pretty much controlled by other people. You had to go to war and fight for a leader you'll never meet in a cause that you probably have no idea about. And once again, the scene serves the symmetrical narrative of the film, which plays out right throughout the film. Now we get another flashback to the Siege of Troy. The horse has been dragged inside the walls. It's been erected in the courtyard. Kind of makes me wonder, how would it have fit through the doors because its legs are sticking out and it's on its side? I think the Trojan horse in Troy made a hell of a lot more sense. I've seen that horse too. It's in Chinukli. I took many pictures of it. I'll be posting them on Instagram at some point. After the film was made, Warner Brothers had this giant steel and, I think, fiberglass horse, and they donated it to Çanakkale in Turkey, which is where the city of Troy is believed to have been located. It's very cool. It's right on the walkway, right next to the ocean. A very beautiful spot. It's at night. The horse is erected in the courtyard. That was a cool scene. I think the horse, the way it is in the film, could have worked if it was on a platform too, because it could have been too tall to get in the gate, but they could have still erected it and you still would have kept that scene. It also makes you wonder how many of the soldiers inside had pretty severe concussions after they'd been dragged out of the sand, dragged on rollers, then erected in a courtyard inside a wooden horse. Now, there's a cool scene of a Trojan soldier stabbing the horse. One of the troops gets hit. The other guys in the horse cover his mouth, and someone wipes the blood off the sword. The locals want to burn it, but the Trojans are protecting it as a peace offering, which is what Sinon told them. So it's now nighttime, and Odysseus sneaks out of the horse. I did like when he hits the ground, his leg is cramped, or he's got like a numb foot because he's been cramped up in this horse for 2 days. But at the same time, there's a couple of Trojan guards facing the other way. You think the thing would be surrounded, or there'd be guards all over the place, because surely you'd have to think that this seems a little bit too good to be true, or maybe not. This is also a time where war was fought with honor. Men and warriors fought with honor. They honored the gods and the conduct of war. And this is ultimately why Odysseus is punished in the story, is because he does break the laws of Zeus. You're supposed to have honor in warfare, and he does something very dishonest and very sneaky. Now, he does it to end the war so everyone can go home, to save his own men's lives and the lives of the Greeks, because the war has kind of stalemated. Everyone's sitting on the beach, very war-weary. So Odysseus' men Menelaus and the men inside stealth kill the Trojans. They make their way to the gate. They take out some of the sentries on the walls. Odysseus does this on a moonless night, meaning there's basically no moonlight. It's very dark. They get some weapons. It's unclear if they get them from the tent they pass in the scene or if they smuggled them with them. I'm pretty sure they took them with them, because you couldn't leave something like that to chance, because you could be easily cut down and not make it to the gate in order to let everybody in. Now, I will say the scenes at night were actually really well shot, and this is no surprise. It is a Christopher Nolan film. It's big, epic. The city feels like it's real. It doesn't look like a cheap set. It's got stairs and alleyways and houses. It feels very realistic, despite the fact the Trojans are dressed like elves. There's some trees in the city near the gate, and there's a bit of a shootout with some archers. Odysseus is shooting Trojans with the arrows. They're having arrows fired back at him, and Menelaus is chucking spears during this battle in between the trees while the men are trying to open the gates. And that was pretty cool, because the scene before that, Odysseus makes his way up the steps and drops a lantern or something, and it breaks on the ground, even though I don't think lanterns were around. It should have been a torch. And you see all these Greeks waiting underneath the walls of Troy, which would have had to be very fucking quiet. I don't know if you could keep that many people quiet, because the sentries don't hear them on the walls or see them. Even though it's dark, you still would have seen some glimmer off the armor. Someone would have made a noise. Someone would have farted and given everybody away. The city gates are opened, and out of the darkness is the imposing silhouette of Agamemnon. I thought this was a bit pretentious. Everyone's saying, oh, this is an aura farm. That's the new word now, aura. So he's got so much aura around him, bro. Realistically, a few Trojan archers would have just filled him full of arrows. Because it seems very stupid that the king, the leader of the Greek army, is just standing there. You don't see anyone else around him. He starts making his way into the city, and then thousands of Greeks start running around him into the city in order to sack it. And he's just walking there. Everyone's running around him. Yeah, while it does look cool, it just comes off like Nolan has made this guy the villain of a superhero film. He's trying to make him this larger-than-life character, and it comes off more as a superhero film rather than a film set in ancient Greece. That's not even taken into consideration. The armor does look like Batman, and it wouldn't have been out of place on the set of The Dark Knight. I just think it's a bit too modern superhero film to really take seriously as a story set 3,500 years ago. You might think of something completely different. You might think it's the coolest thing you've ever seen, and Agamemnon's got aura. I just thought it was a bit corny and a bit lame, because Agamemnon doesn't really do anything in the film to be threatening. He just stands there and does this very exaggerated turnaround, and then people bow to him. He's trying to be Darth Vader without throttling anyone to death in the opening minutes of the film to be threatening. And as I mentioned before, the Baron in June, even though he's basically a fat, obese slug who is so lazy he has to float around, he's menacing because as soon as he gets up, you know someone's going to get killed. Darth Vader, you know, if there's an Imperial officer in the scene, they're probably not going to walk out of it. Agamemnon, it's all for show. He's a lot of bark and no bite. There's a lot to take in with this film too. There's been so many time changes and bouncing around between the past and the present. There's a lot to take in one viewing. I'm definitely going to have to see it again at some point. I'm not going to pay for it in cinema again, but on Blu-ray to try to understand or get what Nolan was trying to do. And I love those comparisons that have been seen on social media of, this is a regular cinema, this is the IMAX 70mm. So, okay, cool. If you're one of the lucky people that lives near one of the 41 of these cinemas worldwide and you don't mind paying $50 or however much it costs to go see it, yeah, great, good for you. All those fucking idiots that are going to drive 3 or 4 hours just to see a movie because the next town over has the IMAX 70mm. This is what you see on a regular screen. This is what you see on IMAX. Fuck off. The screen I saw it on was fine. The story was still the same. Didn't really miss much. Maybe an inch or two off of a crest on a helmet, but nothing more than that. So from there we get a flashback to Odysseus on the island of Ogygia, I think that's how it's pronounced, where he's been living with Calypso. He's living with Calypso on this island, wandering a very desolate-looking beach. And that's one of the other big issues I have with the film is a lot of the backgrounds in this look so bleak and desolate. It doesn't look really like the Mediterranean. Some scenes do. Some scenes you have the turquoise water and more of the Mediterranean geography. But Calypso's island looks so barren and so desolate. It looks like just a sandy island in the middle of the fucking ocean somewhere. It should be this beautiful, lush island with a cave where the goddess lives. That's how I see it anyway. Yet she lives in this kind of very rudimentary wicker hut with not a lot of shelter. And once again, I'll go back to the book. Odysseus lives with the goddess for 7 years on this island. He goes back every night to sleep with her in this cave. She loves Odysseus and is kind of keeping him there more or less against his will to some point. In the movie, Odysseus is on this island. He really doesn't remember a lot, and it's obvious to tell he's kind of living in this false state of bliss because he's been eating the lotus flower, which is mentioned heavily in the book. Now, the lotus flower is kind of like a drug that makes you stay in a bliss-like state and forget the past and the future. It kind of keeps you like in this middle ground, which is how Calypso has been keeping Odysseus on this island. So from there, the Greeks make their way up the coast where they come across a small village that they sack and loot. They steal all the animals and food and burn down the huts, which I didn't think was very nice. There's an old man they talk to who's about the only Greek-looking person in the film. Odysseus talks to this man with the help of a translator. He tells Odysseus to beware of the waters on his return journey because there are many dangers ahead, which Odysseus doesn't really take seriously. And once again, I go back to the book. In the book, this is the Sicon raid. I think the island's called Sicon. They raid this village before the villagers get reinforcements, and there's a big battle that ensues, and a lot of Odysseus' men are killed. So I didn't think that was particularly well handled because they kind of come off like a bunch of marauding Vikings. So this brings us to the first hurdle on Odysseus' journey home, and that is the island of the Cyclops. There's some very cool cinematography when they hit the beach here. It looks like the Mediterranean. The island does look like an island you would see in the Mediterranean, and I do know the film was shot mostly in the Mediterranean, but it doesn't always come off like that, and I'll get into that a bit later. But this island has a lot of sandy-coloured rocks, lots of vegetation, it's not jungle obviously, but it's more of a Mediterranean type vegetation. Odysseus and his crew make their way up this steep mountain pass. After spotting a lone sheep, Odysseus says sheep always move in flocks, anticipating that there's going to be more of them. They come across a very ominous-looking cave where there are giant bags of cheese hanging on the walls and a fire, and it's pretty obvious that somebody lives here. They hang around in the cave waiting for the owner. It's during this scene too that Odysseus' character starts to separate a lot from Homer's version of Odysseus, because I nearly got the sense that Odysseus was just going to kill whoever came back, but someone reminds him that that would be violating the gods' laws of hospitality, and we have to have something to barter. We can't just take something and leave. We have to give them something so that they decide to wait for the owner to return. But to everybody's surprise, the occupant of the cave is a giant cyclops, who is also a shepherd. A flock of sheep enter the cave, followed by the giant, who closes the door. And I wasn't overly impressed with this sequence because everyone's making this big deal about this, saying, oh, this was like this huge horror element of the film. It wasn't scary. Maybe that was because I already knew what was going to happen, but I didn't think it was particularly scary or horrifying. There is a couple of like suspenseful moments when the Cyclops closes the cave with a giant rock. The cave goes dark and the Cyclops disappears into the darkness. One of Odysseus' men is near the fire and he says, "Get away from the light before he's eaten." Now, the practical effects were pretty good. The design of the Cyclops, I don't know, I didn't like a lot. It's basically just a giant, naked, dirty monster with this kind of inverted eye instead of the traditional looking Cyclops eye, which makes it unique. But he has this disfigured face too. The big problem I have is, in this version, the Cyclops is just a monster. He eats a couple of people, then just goes to sleep with these guys in the cave. And the reason he feels comfortable enough to kind of go to sleep with a bunch of armed strangers is because he's the only one that can unlock the door. And like Odysseus points out to one of his men, if we kill the giant, we're trapped in the cave. We need him to open the door. Now, in the book, they get talking to the Cyclops. They get him drunk before running the hot wooden skewer into his eye. They don't get him drunk in the film. After a day, a few more men are eaten. They warm up a big piece of wood and run it into his eye, blinding the Cyclops, who prays to Poseidon to avenge him. Now, this is one of the biggest crimes Nolan commits against the source material, besides the others I've already outlined, because Nolan omits one of the most key pieces to this scene, and that is the nobody speech. Because during the conversation between the Cyclops and Odysseus, the Cyclops asks what Odysseus' name is, and he says nobody. After the Cyclops is blinded, he is screaming in the cave, which causes neighbouring Cyclops to come and check on him. It's not overly explained in the book where they come from. We kind of assume there's more Cyclopses on the island, but they bang on the rock door and ask Polyphemus, which is the name of the Cyclops, "Are you all right?" The Cyclops replies, "Nobody hurt me," and they think everything's okay and leave. Now, that is a brilliant move on Odysseus' part because he's lied to this Cyclops. But there is a reason for this, and there's a lesson to be learnt from this story that Nolan completely cuts out. I don't know why Nolan omitted that because it kind of counteracts what's to come on the voyage home. One of the core themes of the Odyssey is brawns don't always win the day. Sometimes brains are better than brawn. And Odysseus is a master planner, and he's described as this master schemer. So after he's blinded the Cyclops in the book, and the other Cyclopses have gone away, he says something to the effect of, "My name is Odysseus, I was the one that blinded you," which causes the Cyclops to pray to Poseidon, because Poseidon is his father, to curse and wreck Odysseus' voyage home, which explains the troubles he finds himself in later on in the story. Now, you hear the Cyclops screaming and praying to Poseidon, which is kind of a little bit hard to hear, but a couple of the crew pick up on the Cyclops speaking and praying to Poseidon. This scene would have been so much more scary and psychologically intimidating if Nolan kept it as close to Homer's version as possible, because taking that key passage out completely changes not only Odysseus' character, but why he encounters so much trouble later on. Because it shows you that Odysseus is a proud man. He is more or less a glory-seeking man. He can be a bit, not so much arrogant, but hubris is definitely a weakness of Odysseus, and he is punished for that greatly later on. And that is one of the core lessons of the Odyssey, is hubris has consequences. And this scene is the greatest example of that, because he blinds the Cyclops. He has already lied to him, so he doesn't know his name, but he has to get that little piece of glory and say, "It was I, Odysseus, who blinded you," causing the Cyclops to evoke his father's revenge upon him, which obviously leads to the death of crew and the delay in the voyage home, which takes a huge moral toll on Odysseus. Looking back on it, I see why Nolan has done it, because he does flirt this line between the gods being real and just being figments of Odysseus' imagination or Telemachus' imagination, which was very frustrating and an aspect of the film I really did not agree with or like. So to get out of the cave, they decide to hide within the flock of sheep. The sheep have to be let out in the morning. The Cyclops is sitting near the door. He opens up the door to let the sheep out, but he's got his hand there, feeling the backs of the sheep, looking for the men who blinded him. Now, as Homer puts it, Odysseus ties his crew to the biggest rams, and they make their way out of the cave. There's a scene where the Cyclops opens the door and he gets a couple of men to make a break for it, to go down to the ships to get help. But these men are either stepped on or eaten. So he is playing with people's lives to a degree. But at the same time, it was an opportunity they needed to test. In Nolan's version, they tie shrubs to themselves in order to confuse the blinded Cyclops to get out, which I think hiding under the sheep would have been a much better thing to do. It would have probably been a bit funnier too, and unfortunately there's really no humour in this movie. It takes itself very seriously. And there are funny moments in the Odyssey, or some more lighthearted moments. I just don't think Nolan does a very good job of capturing the lesson or the myth of this scene. I think he really misses the point. The other problem here is all the trials on the journey happen very close together, which is how it happens in the book, so I can't fault Nolan for that. But there's not a lot of scope to this journey. There's a lot of style and a lot of action set pieces and fights here and there, but unfortunately there's not a lot of scope to this scene. And for all the use of IMAX cameras and filming it in exotic locations, I kind of think he misses the point a lot. Because from there, the crew leave the cave, they run back to the ships with the blinded Cyclops chasing them. And another thing I picked up about this film, there's not a lot of blood. Now, I thought Nolan was supposed to make this R-rated, hardcore version of the Odyssey. But in Australia, it's rated M. I think it's like mature themes, medium-level violence, yada, 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 which would probably be MA in America. I always thought it was going to be MA, but I guess that was just a bullshit marketing ploy. Because there should have been some blood with the Cyclops. There's not a lot of blood, full stop, in this film. Unfortunately, that's another point I have to deduct from the realism tally. So the crew head to the ship. They get on the ship before the Cyclops makes its way down to the beach. One guy's left behind and gets crushed. The Cyclops disappears in the water. The ship's making a break for it. The Cyclops picks up a rock and throws it at it. And once again, back to the book, there's a couple, I think several Cyclopses, or just the blinded Cyclops hurling boulders at them from the cliff, and it creates a big splash that pulls the ship back. So from there, the crew are back on the ship, heading out to sea. Eurylochus, Odysseus' right-hand man, confronts him on the ship. They start butting heads. Odysseus and the crew are kind of at odds. They blame Odysseus for leading them into the cave, which cost several lives. But there is no tension to this scene. You never really feel like the crew's going to mutiny, because in Homer's version, the crew is half responsible for the predicament they find themselves in. It's not always Odysseus' fault, where Nolan has chosen to make most of the problems Odysseus's. He's the cause of most of the men's suffering as well as his own, which I think is really disingenuous to the character, because he gets the blame. Sometimes it's his own ego and his own hubris that leads him into these situations. But at the same time, the men also want to plunder because they're hungry, they want food, or they think there's plunder they can find. There's a scene in the book where they pretty much make their way back home. Odysseus can see the fires of Ithaca. They're that close. Odysseus falls asleep, which he does fall asleep quite a lot in the book. And one of the gods has given Odysseus a bag of wind. Now, the purpose of the bag of wind is to make his journey, I think, more straightforward. If he can control the wind, he can get home. But the crew think that Odysseus is lying to them, because the gods will speak to Odysseus and give him this information, not everybody else. They think he's hiding treasures or something valuable in the bag, so when he's asleep, they steal the bag and open it, letting out the wind, which blows them off course back out to sea, back to pretty much where they came from, or further back, that they have to more or less restart this journey. well, not restart it, but they had to start at a significant point had they not opened the bag. So a bit more tension with this scene would have been cool, but at the same time, I think Nolan has changed Odysseus' character a little too much. She's kind of taken the core essence of Odysseus away, because it isn't always his fault. Yeah, well, fair enough. You can argue that he did lead the crew into the Cyclops cave, so that might be on him. It fractures the story a bit too much for me. And from here, like, as I just mentioned, there's no tension, and this just leads to another action set piece. So back in Ithaca, Telemachus and Penelope are arguing. Telemachus is telling the mother that he is a man and he wants to go and find his father. He blames the mother for not standing up to the suitors and just waiting for a king. Penelope is one of the most emotionally driven characters in the film. She's not very much like Homer's version either. Telemachus, I don't think, is that boisterous to his mother. He comes up with this plan to secretly leave under the nose of the suitors, take a couple of loyal men and travel to Sparta to see King Menelaus to see if he can find any information on the whereabouts of his father. Now, Penelope and him butt heads here. She tells him about the rumours of the sea people sacking towns very close to Greek waters. I did think it was very interesting because that it does kind of fit in with the history of the region. Now, the scenes of Telemachus and Penelope, they do get a bit heated and dramatic. They're always arguing about something. They usually argue about a difference of philosophy. Telemachus tells his mother that he's a man and he's ready to lead and he's going to go find his father. Penelope, he accuses the mother of not doing enough in terms of the suitor problem. He says you just should marry one of them. That way I only have one to deal with. And she makes some type of male-hating comment saying, I've been waiting for a king, yada, yada, yada. I'm not just a queen waiting for a king, I've been waiting for Odysseus. Now, Anne Hathaway's performance was very good. She was a good choice for Penelope, the loyal wife that believes her husband will come back. The only problem is I don't always believe that she believes that Odysseus is going to come back. Homer's Penelope differs slightly. She does have her doubts whether he's alive, but deep down she always knows Odysseus is going to come back. I just don't think this is well enough defined with Anne Hathaway's Penelope. I don't really think she has enough screen time either. I did want a bit more with Penelope, but a lot of the characters, they dip in and out of the story because it is such a big, long film and there's so much to cover. A lot of characters do go missing for large periods of the film. There is a cool scene with Eumaeus and Melanthius, I think that's how you pronounce his name. Melanthius, however it's pronounced, played by Logan Marshall Green. He wears spurs on his boots like a cowboy. I didn't even know spurs were invented. The half-blind Eumaeus hears him and he always knows that he's up to something because he can hear the spurs. He says to him early in the film, a cowherd shouldn't wear spurs because it gives you away. Now, Eumaeus was one of my favourite characters. I thought John Leguizamo did a great job, even though he is this combination of two different characters. I did like his portrayal of Eumaeus because he's like this half-blind old man that doesn't miss a beat. He always knows what's going around. He knows who the good suitors are and the bad ones, even though he can't always see them. But at the same time, there's no tension or real threat from the suitors. At no point did I really think any of them were at risk of being killed. In previous versions, like the Ralph Fiennes, The Return, the suitors are pretty menacing. They form a hunting party and try to kill Telemachus and Odysseus and Eumaeus. That does happen later in the film, but it's not quite that dramatic. And I think if there's a bit more tension with that, the urgency with the suitor situation would have been a bit more evident. Because half the time they're just hanging around to get free food and wine. And I did like Robert Pattinson's performance, but I think it could have been a bit more treacherous, a bit more diabolical, because he has a talent to pull that off. I just don't think it translated that well. And once again, this might be due to time, the weird editing of the film sometimes, because it is such a long film. It's 2 hours and 52 minutes. So from there we get more flashbacks. Telemachus leaves to find Daddy. Mentor goes with him. They arrive in Sparta to see Menelaus. And we've had a couple of brief scenes with Helen, but this is the first time we actually get Helen in any type of dialogue. And Helen is played by Lupita Nyong'o. This has created a lot of controversy for Nolan portraying Helen as black. Some people say it doesn't matter, other people are up in arms about it. I, for one, think sticking to the most common interpretation of Helen, or the one that Homer gives us, fair-haired Helen, Helen of the pale arms, which would imply that she is of lighter skin colour. She also would have been a Spartan woman, and we do know the Spartans weren't black. We can have that argument that ancient Greece and the ancient world was more multicultural than people want to admit, which is, I think, is 100% true. The ancient world would have been more multicultural. After all, these were big trading ports, and these trade routes went through Africa and Greece. Africa's not that far away from Greece, so not that hard to believe. Odysseus in the book has Ethiopian allies. The Ethiopians in the Iliad come to help the Trojans under the Trojan warrior Memnon. So it's not out of the realms of possibility that African people could have been in Greece. I just don't think there's any logical explanation to make Helen black. If she was Spartan, which is the general consensus, that's what Homer says, she's a Spartan woman, the Spartans lived up in the mountains, she probably would have been more pale. Most of my friends are Italian, and they're a little darker than me, but not much, and I'm pretty pale. That's not to come off racist or anything, I'm just trying to be realistic, because that has been a huge backlash about this film, and I think rightfully so, because it doesn't make any sense. Lupita Nyong'o is a great actress. I just don't see 1,000 ships being launched because of her. She's not a good representation of the idea of Helen. And I think Tarantino said this on a Rogan episode. If you're making a film, you have to play the laws of averages. Like George Lucas, when he wrote Princess Leia, he couldn't make it too tall, too short, too blonde, because then you alienate half the audience. Some men like blonde women, others don't. So the safest course of action is to just make her a brunette. Average height, not too over the top and not too plain, because you're playing to this law of averages. You know, not everybody's going to like a character. I think that's pretty obvious. You can't please everybody, but you have to please the 75%. Tarantino gave a really good example too. He said, if you're writing a scene for a film, the scene calls for a man sitting at a bar, then all of a sudden the most beautiful woman in the world walks in. How do you describe that? Do you give her big tits and blonde hair? Do you make her tall and blonde, short and brunette? You're going to turn off some part of the audience, but you have to get the 75% of people in the audience to agree with this vision. So if you had Scarlett Johansson walk into the scene, most people could probably unanimously agree that she is a good representation of the most beautiful woman in the world, or someone like Margot Robbie. Now, if you want to be subversive and you have someone like Helena Bonham Carter, not saying she's not attractive, but she's probably not the best representation of the most beautiful woman in the world. And I don't like judging people on their looks, but Hollywood and films are a visual medium. Now, you can't convey that convincingly if you're picking an actress who doesn't portray those characteristics physically. She's a great actress, no doubt. I don't think there's too many people starting a war based on her looks. And this is where we get the first scenes with Menelaus and Telemachus, and really the first time Menelaus has had any real dialogue in the film. We've had him in the flashback scenes in Troy. And this is where I have another bone to pick with Nolan, because he subverts the character of Menelaus. Now, Menelaus is unusually aggressive, and going back to the Xenon and the Greek hospitality, there's a cool scene where Mentor and Telemachus make their way through the docks of Sparta. They go ask to see the king. The steward shows them into the palace and says that the king likes to meet all new travelers. It's a wedding night or something. There's a big banquet going on. There's fire jugglers and dances and stuff like that. It's a very cool scene, very elaborate. They meet Menelaus at this table, introduce themselves, they get food and wine. And Menelaus comes off as a complete prick. He's very hospitable in the book. He's also described as auburn-haired Menelaus, so for whatever reason, Nolan has made him bald with a black beard. Now, I love John Bernthal. I don't think he was a great choice for Menelaus. Because Nolan's also made Menelaus a wife-beater, because he's talking to Telemachus and says, this is Helen, do you believe this is the face that launched 1,000 ships? Then he grabs her by the chin and turns her head around quite forcefully and says, maybe more like 500, because he's basically disfigured her face and carved it up, which is not in the book or any of the versions I've ever heard of. I was a bit shocked by this because Menelaus has like disfigured his wife, the most beautiful woman in the world. So to me, this is Nolan subverting not only Homer, but he's subverting the idea of beauty. And that's something I'd noticed throughout the film, is a lot of the female characters don't appear to have a lot of makeup on. They've been made to look more dull in a way. Zendaya is the most obvious. Even the interviews I've seen, they make her look like she's not wearing any makeup whatsoever. And yeah, maybe that was a creative choice. Maybe that was that was done for realism. But if the rest of the film was realistic, I could probably have got on board with that. It just seems like they've made Zendaya look not like you would think a goddess looks like, but more like an average person. And look, all the women in this film are beautiful, good-looking women. I like Zendaya. I think she's probably in too many films. She's a very versatile young actress. I just don't get why you would try to make her look less impressive than she actually is, unless it is for the purpose of subverting this idea of female beauty. The same way Nolan appears to be subverting the idea of male heroism. A lot of the men in this story, their characters have been changed and subverted. Their different versions of what they should be, which I do think ultimately changes the contextual narrative of the story. Nolan, in some parts, has basically made Odysseus pretty much a man suffering from very obvious PTSD. And while the horrors and the consequences of war are touched upon in the Odyssey, they are quite a prevalent part of the story. That's not the main focus, because the focus is more so the hubris and the glory of Odysseus. And that's what Homer is telling us in the Odyssey, is no matter how smart you are, in the case of Odysseus, he's a very smart man. He's ended the Trojan War through cunning and wit, but ultimately he lacks humility, and it's that lack of humility that gets him into trouble. Not so much because he's mentally wounded from war or he has PTSD. There's a lot more things happening with Odysseus that Homer gets to the heart of that I think Nolan has completely overlooked. And this is a similar thing he's done with Menelaus. Like, why is Menelaus disfiguring his wife, the most beautiful woman in the world, if it wasn't to subvert the idea of female beauty? Is he trying to say that women are victims of tyrannical men or men in positions of leadership? Because there is quite a lot of that anti-male rhetoric in this film, which doesn't appear in the book. And I know Christopher Nolan has based his version of the book on the Emily Wilson translation, which has been accused of being very woke with a lot of feminist ideas. She has been critical of other mostly male translators and their interpretation of certain words and feelings of characters. And if you know anything about these ancient texts, they're pretty much all translated from something, so it's very hard to try to find one that isn't. But there has been many translations of the Odyssey. There's one that is very poetic in style. That translator favoured the poetry side. There's one that sticks as close to the literal Greek translation. There's the Wilson translation. I think she's tried to stick close to the Greek, but she's also changed a couple of the key scenes involving Telemachus and the mother and some of the language. I'm reading the 1948 translation, which was translated by E.V. Rue or Rial, however you pronounce his name. So you get a different meaning depending on what translated version you read. And I think Nolan should probably have read a few more versions of this. But anyway, that's getting a bit off topic. The other big problems with the banquet scene is it's just so dark. There's a big colourful party going on because you can see the gold reflecting through the light. But once again, the scene is just so dark. It's dark, it's dull. The tone definitely does not match the source material. Menelaus fills in Telemachus with what happened to Odysseus after the war. So we get another flashback to Troy. Telemachus starts to cry after hearing the story about his father. But this scene, Telemachus doesn't introduce himself as Telemachus or the son of Odysseus, but Helen seems to know who he is. Maybe he did, and I kind of switched off during this part, but I'm pretty sure he doesn't introduce himself, but Helen knows who he is despite them never meeting before. Mentor and Telemachus introduce themselves as traitors. In the source material, different story, Telemachus and Menelaus get along quite well. He tells him he's the son of Odysseus. Menelaus says, "Your father was one of my friends." He fills him in on the backstory and tells him that he'd basically give him some mercenary troops to go cleanse the palace, and that these suitors are basically insolent bastards who are defying Zeus. So now we're back on the high seas, following Odysseus' crew around the Mediterranean, and we come to the land of giants. They get off the ship, they make their way a few meters inland into a pretty heavily wooded area. It's snowing. I didn't know it snowed in the Mediterranean. Odysseus leads his crew inland where they come across a lone figure in the forest. Now this figure is wearing this like silver looking cape thing with a very weird looking silver helmet. It turns around and it's a very large girl who lets out a deafening scream. Eurylochus tells the girl that they just want food, they're not here to hurt her. Before a bunch of giants wearing what looks like very modern steel armour come out of the mist to attack Odysseus' crew. And this was one of the most retarded scenes in the film. It was just a dumb action set piece. Now in the source material, this place is like a town or a city, a small city of some type. There's a dock. Odysseus docks his ship there. The other ships are down the coast somewhere. Odysseus sends a couple of people to try to make contact. They meet the king of the giants, basically, who brutally kills one of Odysseus' crew and eats him. The race of giant-like beings, as they're described by Homer, are called the Lysagarians or the Lysagarians, however it's pronounced. Now the men run down to the ships. They get cut to pieces by the giants. They're basically giant cannibals. All the ships are destroyed. His men are basically decimated. Odysseus and his crew get away, but the rest of his crew are killed. Odysseus' crew fight the giants. They're cut to pieces. There's a scene that looks like the trees are revolving. I don't know if that was just because that's how the camera was moving, but it looks like the trees are moving because several of the crew just kind of run into like a couple of thin trees and they get stuck. They turn around and the giants just cut them to pieces. This scene was fucking dumb. It was stupid. It was completely bamboozling because it doesn't make any sense. Like, they just have this army of giants waiting in the mist for Odysseus' crew. It is so rushed. There's no build-up or tension. They just arrive on the banks of this island. They make their way inland, probably like 100, 200 meters, meet this mysterious figure. She calls for help, and then all these giants just come out of essentially mist while it's snowing and cut the crew to pieces. Completely and utterly stupid. It completely misses the point. And it just comes off like a big action set piece for a modern audience that just doesn't have the attention span to work out what's going on. The crew are basically cannon fodder. They're all just these scared group of men running around with no idea what they're doing. This causes the survivors to flee to the ships. There's a cool scene of all the crew running out of the forest onto the beach, making their way back to the ships being pursued by the giants. Now, Odysseus' crew get in the boats. The two smaller boats are smashed to pieces. The giants sink them, kill all the crew. There's a bit of blood in this scene. Eurylochus is grabbed by a giant. He's taken under the water. Odysseus shoots and kills a giant. He shoots him in the neck with an arrow and kills it before saving Eurylochus and heading out to the ocean with the survivors. Most of his crew are just hacked to bits on the beach, which causes more animosity between Odysseus and the crew. The crew blame him, even though in the source material, they go there looking for food and supplies. They don't know what type of race is there because that's why he sends scouts. But Nolan basically just lets Odysseus do all the scouting and all the leading. There's a lot of times when I was watching the film where I had like a furrowed brow and I had this very dismayed look on my face, even though I obviously couldn't see my face while I was watching the film. I could feel my eyebrows tightening up throughout the film because a lot of this was just so nonsensical. The biggest gripes I have with this scene is like the girl just calls for help, the giants come out of the mist. Why are the giants wearing armor? They're a race of cannibalistic giants. Who the fuck are they fighting? Who is posing a big enough threat to a race of giants that they need to have head-to-toe steel plate armor on? You can be creative here and there, but if you're trying to set a film in the fucking Bronze Age, it might help to actually include elements of the Bronze Age. In the scene with Mentor and Telemachus training, I swear Telemachus is wearing a pair of Adidas Superstars or Converse All-Stars. There's some very modern-looking footwear. There's even a shot of a sole of someone's foot, and it looks like a kind of like a modern-ish tread. I don't know if that was a mistake or that was meant to be there, but there's too many modern elements. The costumes are too modern, the dialogue's modern, the politics and some of the themes are modern. The narrative has been changed to suit a modern audience. I don't get why the giants are wearing steel armor that looks like it's from the medieval period rather than just rudimentary clothing or skins or furs or something like that, because they're supposed to be these cannibalistic giants. The other issue is they all look like they're wearing these like black like bodysuits underneath. It looks like they're wearing Under Armour underneath the steel plate armor. I just thought it was really fucking stupid. It doesn't even look cool either. Like the armor looks pretty shit, and the giants aren't really scary. There's not a lot of tension because you know that the crew's just going to get their ass kicked, and there's no reason for them to be attacked in the first place. They just turn up on the island and all of a sudden the giants just come out of the smoke to kill the crew. Now, if you had have followed the source material, it would have been a hell of a lot more compelling, because one of Odysseus' crew meets with the king. They go into the city, they're killed, they run out the door, and they have to make their way back to Odysseus to warn him that these guys are a bunch of cannibalistic giants. And then the massacre follows. So this just comes off as a dumb action set piece for a modern audience with no attention span. Get to the island, now all of a sudden the threat comes out of the shadows. Action set piece, back in the boats, back onto the high seas. Bit stupid, I thought. And one thing Nolan is really successful at is taking a lot of the mystique and the mystery out of the Odyssey. Because the way it's most generally seen is that Odysseus and his crew go on this grand over-the-top adventure where there's a lot of misfortune and drama that follows Odysseus and the crew. They go to island throughout the Mediterranean, obviously, and they encounter all these weird and wonderful and dangerous creatures and elements. Nolan's version is so cold and dark and dull, it is very hard to try to buy into the time period and even the place in the world it takes place. Like, everything looks so cold. Like, it's snowing on this island, once again, not in the source material. You're probably getting sick of me saying that, but it doesn't make sense, Nolan's creative direction. I think to most people, Odysseus is cruising around the Mediterranean. He goes to these wonderful islands. Like, I think in some versions they're nearly described as tropical islands. The environment is very inviting and very nice, and then they discover this horror lurking beneath the surface. Or they go to an island that's really beautiful, everyone wants to stay there, but there's this hidden danger. And in Nolan's version, like most of the islands, if you saw them, if you were just cruising by, you probably wouldn't want to stop because they don't look too inviting. It's just dark and void of any real personality. Like, it should be Mediterranean, it should be green and vibrant, but Nolan has chosen this ultra dark color palette. So from there's more cruising on the Mediterranean until Odysseus spots yet another island where they land. And this is Circe's island. The crew make their way up to a small hut on this island. Once again, this looks like the south of Wales. It looks like it's freezing fucking cold. The crew go past a bunch of big cats that are sporadically spread out on this trail up to this old stone hut. Now, before the crew embark on this new journey, Odysseus is once again going to lead them, where Eurylochus says that the men don't want you to go on this journey, they want you to stay here, which Odysseus obliges them, which once again, in the source material, he sends them to go scout this island. There's a small town or something, or there's a temple in Homer's version. This time around in Nolan's, it's just a dilapidated stone hut pretty much. It's pretty grotty and pretty horrible. There's holes in the wall, there's the wind blowing, it's cold and it's damp and doesn't look very inviting. So Odysseus says that, okay, I'll stay near the boats and I'll make sure we have something for dinner. So he goes off and hunts. He finds a random deer he starts to track down. Eurylochus enters the hut. Circe comes home. She is surprised. She starts screaming. He goes outside and she trips over and says, "We're just here for food. We don't mean you any harm," yada, yada, yada. Circe tells them to take their weapons and armour off, leave them outside. Odysseus' men do this. One of them turns around and sees a bunch of armour and weapons lying rusting on the ground, and yet no one is really alarmed by this, because you obviously know something is not right. So Circe makes the crew dinner. They're all sitting at the table, chowing down. They're eating like absolute animals. She asks them a few questions, and it's clear something's not right. They're just hoovering down this like tripe or noodle soup stuff. It's fucking disgusting. And she turns the crew to pigs. This is a very amusing part of the book. It's a very elaborate scene. Circe is a witch or a sorceress of some type. She's got a black crow in a cage. Circe is played by Samantha Morton. Then she turns the crew into pigs and leads them out into the pig pen outside. Odysseus is hunting. He spots a deer, releases the arrow and kills it. Then when he approaches the body, he realizes he's just killed a man, and he figures out what's going on, that the animals on the island are actually people that have been transformed. So he goes and confronts Circe. She tries to bewilder him. She has this very persuasive power, but it doesn't work on Odysseus. She asks him to up his dagger, which he has in his boot. Now, according to Homer, Circe's Jedi mind tricks don't work on Odysseus, because he takes this herb called Molly that was given to him by Hermes. Odysseus seems more cunning and more clever than his crew, and he also sees this ring in a bowl, which was one of the rings he took off the crew in the Cyclops cave. So he makes a deal with Circe. He threatens to kill the bird, which was Circe's sister. She turns the pigs back into men, and she makes a really sexist comment. She says, "I'm transforming you back into your disguise," applying that men are pigs, which differs a lot from Homer, because Circe doesn't explicitly say men are pigs, or that they deserve to be transformed into pigs. The transformation is a literal magic within the story. However, there is a very strong symbolic layer that a lot of readers and scholars interpret regarding Circe turning the crew into pigs. So in Homer's story, Circe uses a potion and her wand. The men become pigs physically, but their minds and personalities remain human. Odysseus rescues them and restores them. On the symbolic level, this represents gluttony. The men are controlled by their appetite. They keep eating. It's a loss of civilization. They go from warriors to animals. Their bodies no longer match who they are, and their animal nature takes over. Now, according to the Greeks, they had a very strong idea that what separated humans from animals was reason, or logos. A person ruled only by appetite and instinct was behaving like a beast. So Circe's magic is not saying these men are pigs because they are bad. It's closer to something like they will reveal the animal side of human nature by making the outside match what can exist on the inside. This is an interesting contrast with Odysseus himself, because Odysseus avoids the transformation because he has intelligence, self-control, caution, and he's protected by Hermes the god. But his crew aren't Odysseus. They struggle with these primitive urges. They raid when they should leave. They open the windbag. They slaughter Helios's cattle later on. So it's fitting that Circe turns him into a more basic primitive animal. And it's a separation of civilization from savagery. If we compare this with the Cyclops is a savage being who looks monstrous but is really intelligent. Nolan kind of misses the point with this one, I think. He doesn't really portray him as intelligent. Yes, he can talk, but it's kind of just gibberish. The crew are civilized Greeks who can be reduced to animals. Circe sits in the middle of this. She literally crosses the boundary between human and beast. In Nolan's version, this is evident due to her big cat collection on the way up to the hut. And I think, once again, Nolan really does miss the mark, because he had a really great chance to dig really deep into the psychology and the logos of the Odyssey. But he doesn't. He chooses instead to turn this scene into feminist propaganda, because the comments coming from Circe are pretty sexist. She doesn't really know the crew. She's only just met them, unless she can look into their minds and see what they've done. And so far in the film, the only thing they've really done besides sacking Troy is attacking the Sicon villages, where they burn the huts and steal all the livestock and food. And she mentions to Eurylochus, who really hasn't done anything to her. Yeah, he has been a bit of a prick here and there, but he's not It's not like any of these guys are bad guys. He surprised her in her hut. He says he's not gonna hurt her. He's not the most intimidating member of Odysseus' crew. She says to Eurylochus and other members of the crew that, how can you men go to war and kill men, women, and children, and then you say you want to go home, but you go kill, rape, and plunder more, or something along those lines? So she's making a strong statement that men are governed by their primitive urges, that all men more or less commit war crimes, or they go to war basically to kill and rape whoever gets in their way, and when they go home they do the same thing and they plunder. And yeah, that is hinted at by Homer. The crew do plunder, they do raid, but they are punished severely for their indiscretions. So Odysseus isn't affected by her tricks, he resists them, and once again his cleverness pays off. He makes a deal to restore the crew. From there, Circe tells him if he wants to go home, he has to head to Hades. So the crew are saved, and the journey continues. The crew head towards Hades. They come to the underworld, where they make a blood sacrifice of a fatted ram and a fatted ewe. There's a gold or bronze tray. They kill the unfortunate livestock and drain the blood into the plate. In the book, I think this underworld ritual is a lot better, and it actually would have looked better on screen if Nolan had done this, because in the book they have to dig a trench, fill it with blood, milk, honey, and white barley. The ghosts appear, they drink the blood, and that restores their ability to talk, reason, and answer questions. Until they take the blood, they're basically just a ghost floating around. When they take the blood, they're restored into not so much a human, but kind of like this underworld zombie that has the ability to talk and reason, which I think would have looked visually better too, the white and the red mixing together. But unfortunately, Nolan subverts Homer once again, because this scene rewrites the rest of the narrative, and it really points this story in a completely different direction than it should have been. And once again, it's a great looking scene. It was shot in Iceland with the black sand. It's very dark and it's very brooding, which is what you'd expect. So these hands start popping up and these bodies start crawling out from the black sands, one of which is Sinon, who's covered in this like black oozy oil looking stuff. Now Sinon starts to lament to Odysseus. Sinon more or less blames Odysseus for their death during the Trojan War. He blames Odysseus for lying to him and says, "You left me out there to die. I didn't even know there was Greeks in the horse." So Sinon is more or less guilt-tripping Odysseus due to his past decisions, namely the horse and his actions during the Trojan War. The dead start to grow around Odysseus. The crew are behind him. Some of the new dead start to appear. Odysseus' crew that died in the Cyclops cave start appearing, and now they start blaming him as well. There is a cool scene where Agamemnon appears. He gives a bit of a backstory to what happened to him. He was killed by Helen's sister. This is the first time Agamemnon talks in the film, and the first time you see him without the armour. He has his ritual bath thing when he gets home. The sister Climestria, however you pronounce her name, it sounds like an STD. She bathes him, anoints him with oil, which is kind of gross. He pours olive oil over his head before she stabs him in the throat and murders him, which is consistent with Homer. There's a bit of a backstory with Agamemnon too. He sacrifices his daughter, which is not mentioned by Homer, I don't think. Don't quote me on it. Which is kind of weird too, because with everything that's happened about Hollywood and the Epstein files, and this is going to sound really conspiratorial, like, is Nolan trying to tell us something that, like, this shit is actually fucking real? I think it's pretty undeniable at this point. It's not just a conspiracy theory. The elites do sacrifice people. And as Agamemnon says, he sacrifices his own daughter for power and victory in Troy, or something along those lines. And this narrative pops up twice in the film at different points. Penelope can't believe it. He said, "That's horrible. Like, why would he do that?" And Odysseus explains the consequences of the sacrifice is not on the person that's sacrificed, but it's on the person doing the sacrificing. In other words, he is willingly giving up his daughter to get something, but that comes with a very heavy moral cost. In other words, you're indebted to someone else, and that's a lot of those conspiracy theories about elites and sacrificing children and all that very dark shit that has been circulating around conspiracy circles. That's essentially what that's tapping into. So Agamemnon tells Odysseus that he was murdered not too long after he came home. Now, it's during this scene that Christopher Nolan really does disrespect Homer, but he also completely reinvents this scene, because this is not how this is meant to play out. And before you go, well, it's just his interpretation, stop looking at the book, yada, 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 I'm taking it too literally. This does have a big narrative consequence. In Homer's Odyssey, this scene plays out very differently. Odysseus talks to the ghost of his mother. His mother has died while he's been away. Odysseus is shocked to see his mother in the underworld, but she has a very urgent message for him. She tells him what has happened to his kingdom, about the stresses Penelope and Telemachus are under, and how his kingdom and his palace are in jeopardy of falling to the suitors. And that basically puts Odysseus on a very urgent quest to get home as quickly as he can. And it kind of speeds up the journey because it makes everything more urgent, because he knows there's this time limit now, and that he's been more or less just fucking around, taking the long way home, encountering monsters and witches along the way. Now, all of a sudden, there is an urge he needs to get home to save his kingdom. So without having that scene in it, there's not a real emphasis placed on him needing to get back quickly. And in the film, Nolan has left out Achilles. The ghost of Achilles comes to speak to Odysseus. Now, Achilles' message isn't as important as his mother's. It still carries an important message behind it. Agamemnon is in the book, but he also warns Odysseus about the treachery of women. He says, you can't trust women. He replies, my Penelope would never do that. You have two different leaders. You have two different men in different positions of power with very different wives. Penelope is loyal. That relationship is built on love. He didn't win his wife in a lottery and go to war and kill hundreds of thousands of people because of her. So there's completely two different relationships and two different narratives playing out in Homer's work. And there's two different messages here. Now, he's not really saying that women are evil or you can't trust all women. That's what Agamemnon is saying, because that's based on his experience. Odysseus is saying something else, because Penelope is wise. She believes wholeheartedly her husband's coming home and won't remarry another man because she's loyal to her husband. Ajax also makes an appearance too in the book. He refuses to talk to Odysseus because of a dispute about Achilles' armour. Now, Odysseus' mother in the book is called Anticilla, I'm pretty sure. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Before Odysseus leaves the underworld, Tiresias gives Odysseus a prophecy about his journey home. He tells him about the dangers he's going to face and the difficult choice ahead of him. And this relates to Sulla and Charybdis, the whirlpool and the rock monster, and about the sirens. So things start to heat up in the underworld. The dead start to blame Odysseus, which was really unfair, but also an interesting creative decision from Nolan. This film is full of very interesting creative decisions by Nolan. So he turns to his men and says, let's go, and they all run to the ships. This is another example of modern language. It kind of came off more like Tom Brady leading the Patriots out into the football field rather than an ancient Greek warrior leading his men back to the ships. So the crew make it back to the ship while being chased by the dead. They leave the underworld. And I think that's a good place to end part 1 of the Odyssey Files. We'll pick up part 2 of the review in the next episode. And that brings us to the end of the episode. A big thank you to everyone who listened to the end. I hope you all enjoyed the review and got something out of it, or learnt about the Odyssey and Homer. If you'd like to support the Truth Tank, there's a couple of things you can do. You can head on over to the Facebook and Instagram page, give them a follow and a like. If you really want to support the Truth Tank, you can head on over to my Truth Tank store over on Spring, pick yourself up some merch. You'll be supporting the show and look really cool doing it. If merch isn't your thing, you can head on over to my Buy Me a Coffee page, buy me some tank fuel. You can make a one-off donation of your choosing, whatever you think the show is worth, $1, $10, $100, $50, or you can subscribe to the monthly tiers and support the show that way. Subscriptions start from just $5 a month. You can download and listen to your favorite episodes of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Podbean, Audible, Amazon Music, Castbox, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell anyone you think might like the show. Help spread it around and get the Truth Tank out there. If you're enjoying the show, why not leave a 5-star rating and review? Each review helps the show grow and get found, and is much appreciated by yours truly. And I'll be back in the next week or two with another current event episode, another film review, maybe even a special guest episode. But until then, I'm the Tank. This is the truth. Truth to tell.